All right, this is the in-class review that we're going to do for the Topic 2 Quiz 2. You need to know this material that I'm going to go over now in the video, plus completing the first part of completing the square. All right, on number 1, it says to use the x-intercepts to graph the parabola, find all this other information. Okay, so to find the x-intercepts, that is when y equals 0. So I'm going to plug y in for 0, and then I need to factor it. Well, it's a binomial with the lead, and I can take the square root of both, so it's going to factor to x and x, because that's the square root of x squared. And the square root of 9 is 3, so one's a plus, one's a minus. I am not going to put an I there because the original started with a minus. If it started with a plus, then I would have a minus. And we don't know how to graph imaginary numbers, so we don't need to deal with that. So when I solve, x equals negative 3 and 3. So my x-intercepts are negative 3, 0, and 3, 0. To find the well, first of all, let's plot those points. So negative 3, 0, 3, 0. To find the vertex is exactly halfway in between the two x-intercepts. So it's going to be 0 something. Well, to figure out what that something is, I need to put 0 back into my original equation. So 0 squared minus 9, which is negative 9. So here's 0, negative 9. And then here is my parabola. This one has 2 positive intervals, all the numbers that are less than negative 3 and all the numbers that are greater than positive 3. And the negative intervals, it's just one of them in between negative 3 and 3. And remember, when compound inequalities, you put the smaller number on the left, the bigger number on the right. It's always less than symbols, and x in the middle. All right, number 2. To find the x-intercept, I'm going to plug in 0 for y, and I need to factor. Because the leading coefficient is negative, I know I'm going to have a greatest common factor. I know I can take out at least a negative 1, but in this case, I can actually take out more than a negative 1. I can take out a negative x, and negative x squared divided by negative x is positive x, and then the positive divided by a negative is a negative, and the x's cancel, and I just get 6. So when I solve, I get negative x equals 0 and x minus 6 equals 0. You can't have a positive and negative 0, so x is just 0. And over here, x is 6. So my x-intercepts are 0, 0, and 6, 0. All right, so I've got 0, 0, and 6, 0. My vertex is going to be halfway in between, which in this case is at 3. So now I'm going to plug in the numbers. So I have 3 squared plus 6 times 3. Now when you do this, you have to do the positive 3 squared first, which is 9, and then add your negative. So I have negative 9 plus 18, which is positive 9. So at 3, 9, I'm going to plot my point and draw my parabola. Okay, this one, since it's opening down, is just only one positive interval. All right, so there's just the one positive interval, and it's in between 0 and 6. And then there's 2 negative intervals, everything that's less than 0 and everything that's greater than 6. All right, now this next section says factor. When it says factor, you're going to end with the parentheses. This over here says solve by factoring, and when you end, it's going to be x equals a number. It's different. You have to read the directions. Notice that in the factor completely, there's no equals. Notice in the solve, there's an equals. All right, so let's look at this first one. On this first one, it's a trinomial with the leading coefficient of 1. So I'm going to go straight to my 2 parentheses. I'm going to look for 2 numbers that multiply to negative 18 and add to positive 7. Well, those 2 numbers would be positive 9 and negative 2. We're done. And because it just says factor, we stop. On the second one, or number 4, it's a binomial. I can take the square root of both. So I'm going to go straight to my 2 parentheses. The square root of x squared is x. The square root of 36 is 6. One's a plus and one's a minus. Because this middle term was a plus, I need to add an I. Now look what happens on number 5. It's a binomial. I can take the square root of both terms, so I'm going to go straight to my two parentheses. The square root of 9x squared is 3x. The square root of 100 is 10. One's plus and one's minus, but this one had a minus to start with, so there's no I. On number 6, I want to factor that, but seeing that the leading coefficient is negative, it's like a red flashing light saying take out a greatest common factor first. So I can look and see that my greatest common factor is negative 3. So negative 3x squared divided by negative 3 is x squared. 48 divided by negative 3 is negative 16. In my parentheses, I have a binomial, and I can take the square root of both. So I'm going to go straight to my two parentheses. The square root of x squared is x. The square root of 16 is 4. One's plus, one's minus, and because this right here is a minus, from what I'm factoring, there's no I. On number 7, again, it starts with the leading coefficient that's negative, so I know I need to take out a negative. So I'm going to take out a negative 2, and I'm left with x squared, and then 20 divided by negative 2 is negative 10x. 48 divided by negative 2 is negative 24. So now, when I factor this, it's a trinomial with the leading coefficient of 1, so I'm going to go straight to my two parentheses. Two numbers that multiply to negative 24 and add to negative 10 would be negative 12 and positive 2. Negative 6 and 4 don't work because they add to negative 2 when I add them together, right? So not every combination is going to work. You got to pay attention to your signs. All right, so again, that first section was factoring. You stop at the parentheses. This section is solving. You need to get an answer. On number 8, it's a binomial, but I can't take the square root of both, which leads me to believe there's going to be a greatest common factor. And there is. It's 3. So I'm going to take out a 3, and I'm left with x squared minus 25 equals 0. In the parentheses, I have a binomial, and I can take the square root of both. So I'm going to go straight to my two parentheses. I have an x and an x, because the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 25 is 5. One's plus, one's minus, but since it started with a negative, I do not need to add an I. The 3 does not give me an answer. This gives me x equals negative 5, and this one gives me x equals 5, and I'm done. Number 9. To solve by factoring, the first step is to set equal to 0. It's not equal to 0. I want to keep that x squared positive, so I'm going to leave that where it is and subtract the 40. Now it's equal to 0. It's a trinomial with a leading coefficient of 1, so I'm going to go straight to my two parentheses. The two numbers that multiply to negative 40 and add to negative 3 would be negative 8 and positive 5. Okay? So I get x is 8 from this one, and from this one I get x is negative 5. Now remember, the reason I'm saying that is because, whoops, that's not what I want to write. When I set my equation equal to 0, I'm adding 8 to both sides and getting x is 8. I'm just doing that work in my head. And again, the only time you're going to have I is when you have a binomial and a plus sign. On number 10, first thing, set equal to 0. So when I set equal to 0, I get 4x squared plus 49 equals 0. It's a binomial, and I can take the square root of both, so I'm going to go straight to my two parentheses. The square root of 4x squared is 2x. Square root of 49 is 7. One's a plus, one's a minus. Because I have a plus here, I have to add the I. So when I solve on this first one over here, I'm going to subtract 7 and divide by 2, so I get negative 7i over 2. Over here, I'm going to add 7 and divide by 2, so I get positive 7i over 2. On the last one, number 10, that's solved by factoring. Step 1, set it equal to 0. So I have x squared minus 10x equals 0. It's a binomial, but I cannot take the square root of both of them. But I can look for a greatest common factor, and there is one. It's x. So x squared take away an x is x. Negative 10x take away an x is just negative 10. and now it's factored. I don't need to do any more because now my exponent is just 1. So either x equals 0 or x minus 10 equals 0. So x equals 0 and positive 10. All right, now this section says to solve by taking the square root. So there's different types of solving, and my expectation is that you will follow the directions when you take the quiz. So on the first one, to take the square root of 225, well, that's just 15. But remember, it's plus or minus 15. I'm not adding an I because it's not negative. On the next one, I've got x squared equals negative 49. Because it's a negative, I'm going to rewrite it as 49 times negative 1. Now, I'm going to take the square root of everything. Square root of x squared is x, the square root of 49 is plus or minus 7, and the square root of negative 1 is I. On the last one, I'm going to rewrite that as x squared equals 48 times negative 1. Take the square root of everything. 48 is not a perfect square, so I'm going to have to make a factor tree. So 2 and 24, 2 and 12, 2 and 6, 2 and 3. So when I rewrite this, the square root of x squared is x, plus or minus. Each parentheses represents 1, 2 outside of the radical, and the 3 is not circled, so it goes underneath, and the square root of negative 1 is I. So when I simplify this, I get plus or minus 4 square root 3 I, and that's my answer. Okay, this next section, need to perform the operation. You got to be careful. Right here, there's a minus sign in between, so this one, they want you to subtract. This one, there's no sign in between, which means they're asking you to multiply. You've got to pay attention. Neither one is particularly difficult, you just have to pay attention. So when it's subtraction, I'm going to change the minus to a plus sign and change the sign of everything in the parentheses. Then I can combine like terms. 14 and 6 is 20. Negative 3i and negative 8i is negative 11i. That's my final answer. On 16, I'm going to distribute, because this is multiplying, so I get negative 10i. I'm just kidding. I get positive 10i, because a negative times a negative is a positive. So I have 10i, and then negative 5 times 6 would be negative 30i squared. But we know I squared is negative 1, so this is really negative 30 times negative 1, which is 30. So this is 10i plus 30. All right, on the last one, I'm going to multiply, and because these are conjugates, only when it's a complex conjugate, I can use my shortcut. So negative 4 times negative 4 is 16. Negative 5i times 5i is negative 25i squared, which is just 25. So I have 16 plus 25, which would be 41. All right, the last thing that we can do with complex numbers is to write them in this 8 plus bi form. Now the nice one is when the denominator is just an imaginary number. To do this, the next thing you need to do is just multiply the bottom by the opposite of the imaginary number and the top. On the top, I'm going to have to distribute. So, oops, that is not at all what I meant to write. I've got negative 2 times 3, which would give me negative 6i, and then negative 2i times 4i would be negative 8i squared, which is positive 8. On the bottom, 2i times negative 2i is negative 4i squared, which is positive 4. Now that I have it all simplified, and there's no more like terms, I can split it into two fractions. One fraction is this, negative 6i over 4. I'm going to have a plus sign because there's a plus sign in the middle. The second fraction is this, which would be 8 over 4. Now 6 over 4 doesn't divide in evenly, but it does reduce to negative 3i over 2. 8 over 4 divides to 2, and we're done. One more. on number 19, to be able to write it into this a plus bi form, we need to multiply both the top and bottom by the conjugate of the bottom. So with the conjugate of the bottom, the real number is the same, and the imaginary is the opposite sign, so it's plus I. So whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do to the top to keep it equal. On the top, 6 times 3 is 18. 6 times I is 6I. On the bottom, because they're conjugates, I can use my shortcut. 3 times 3 is 9. Negative I times negative I is negative I squared. Now think about that. That means the negative of negative 1, which would be positive 1. So on the top, nothing else simplifies, so I get 18 plus 6I. On the bottom, 9 plus 1 is 10. Now I can write it into two fractions. 18 over 10 plus 6I over 10. On the first one, it reduces to 9/5, and the second one is 3I over 5. And there's your answer. So again, you need to know this material and also the completing the square part 1 notes for the topic 2, quiz 2 that is in class.